Hi church! So here I am recording the sermon in my study because when I preached it at Ripon tonight I completely forgot to get it recorded. I'm going to do this as if it was live, so I am going to not stop and start or try and make it perfect or polished. It's going to just be raw like every other video I do because it's already midnight. But listen, I don't regret doing it this way. I just regret not being with you. I would love to be with you and be able to do youth camp as well. I just can't do both, obviously. But I'm glad I didn't ask anyone else to preach because I really want to continue this series, and I want to keep it moving along at the same speed as we are at Ripon. I don't want to be on different weeks. So this is a sermon for Sunday the 4th of August. And we are in our summer series, which is called Grow. And last week, if you remember, we were talking about the parable of the sower. So I'm going to start by just reminding you of that. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it today, but I'm just going to remind you of it. And we find it in Matthew 13. So I'm going to read where Jesus tells the parable, and then I'm going to skip to where he explains it. There's a gap in the middle. But I'm just going to skip over that gap for brevity. So, Matthew 13. On verse 1 says, "That day Jesus went out of the house and sat down beside the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he climbed into a boat and sat down. The whole crowd was standing on the shore. He said many things to them in parables. A farmer went out to scatter seed. As he was scattering seed, some fell on the path, and birds came and ate it. Other seed fell on rocky ground where the soil was shallow. They sprouted immediately because the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it scorched the plants, and they dried up because they had no other roots. And they dried up because they had no roots. Other seed fell among thorny plants. The thorny plants grew and choked them. Other seed fell on good soil and bore fruit. In one case, a yield of 100 to 1. In another case, a yield of 60 to 1. And in another case, a yield of 30 to 1. Everyone who has ears should pay attention. Consider then the parable of the farmer. Whenever people hear the word about the kingdom and don't understand it, the evil one comes and carries off what was planted in their hearts. This is the seed that was sown on the path. As for the seed that was spread on rocky ground, this refers to people who hear the word and immediately receive it joyfully. Because they have no roots, they last for only a little while. When they experience distress or abuse because of the word, they immediately fall away. As for the seed that was spread among thorny plants, this refers to those who hear the word, but the worries of this life and the false appeal of wealth choke the word, and it bears no fruit. As for what was planted on good soil, this refers to those who hear and understand and bear fruit and produce, in one case a yield of 100 to 1, in another case a yield of 60 to 1, and in another case a yield of 30 to 1. So we explored that verse at some depth last week, and we talked about what kind of soil you're planted in, or even what sort of soil your heart is. So both the effect of the atmosphere we're in, the people around us, and the environment we're living in, the situation we're living in, but also whether we are actually good soil, whether we are prepared soil, ready to receive what God offers us. This week I just want to carry on to consider kind of what soil we were in before. So I have just had a little thing at the front of my house. I've got a really deep, big planter that goes across the front window here in front of my study. And then I also by the door have two circular planters with a cone-shaped little evergreen tree in. And sadly, one of the evergreen trees had better drainage than the other, and the one that had better drainage had too much drainage, and it died. It didn't get enough watering and was basically a bit remiss in watering them. And one of them survived because it had worse drainage, so the water that had been from before stayed. I'm just going to light myself up a little bit better here. Oh no, I'm not. That's terrible. I'm going to go back to that. Gosh, that looked shocking. So the situation was one of these little evergreen trees died. So in my attempt to make it look better, I took out that little evergreen tree and found a replacement. But when I brought the replacement, it didn't match the first one. So the end result was I decided to put them into the big planter. Bear with me, this does have some relation to what I'm speaking on. So I moved both of these little evergreen trees into different places in the planter because they don't actually match each other. And I could have just put them straight in. Now I knew that the soil in the planter was healthy, good soil, but I knew that the soil in the little pots was probably all used up, had no real nutrients left anymore. It had been compost in a small pot, and it looked the business, it looked fine because it was still dark and it still looked like good compost, but I know that it really wouldn't have much in the way of nutrients left in it anymore. So I shook the soil off the roots and replanted with new compost into the planter to make sure they had what they needed to transplant into the new place. So the first question really is, in relation to us, what sort of soil were you in before? Before you came to faith, or before you came to this church, or before you had this breakthrough in your life that you might be experiencing right now, what was your soil before? What have you been going through in your life? Was it weedy soil? Was it soil that looked fine on the surface but had no nutrients? And for that, I would suggest sometimes there are churches that they look perfectly fine, but we're just not getting fed. Or maybe it was even here. Maybe it's even, since I've been pastor, that there's food available, but you don't know how to receive it. Maybe it's too rich or too weak or not what you need. What soil were you in before? And of course, sometimes that can mean what soil were you in before you came to faith? And often the soil that affects us most is our family soil. It's where are our family roots? Has your growth been distorted by things in the way? Think about plant roots. If there are rocks in the way under the soil, the plant roots become distorted. If you've ever bought a wonky carrot from the shops, you'll know that they can come in all sorts of shapes and forms, because if a stone was in the way, it's going to grow strangely. And we can grow strangely emotionally, we can grow strangely spiritually, because there have been things in the way that have restrained us, or we've had to work around them, or we've been pot bound or in unhealthy soil, and it might have looked fine, but we know that it wasn't fine, and it affected the way we grew emotionally, or affected the way we grew spiritually. And then of course we can have disease, and it could be hidden, but we can have emotional disease, we can have spiritual disease, we can be in an environment where it's so unhealthy that we cannot grow emotionally or spiritually well, and we can end up with damaged parts that need to be cut off, or treated with some sort of treatment to make them fine. And of course, being disturbed, being uprooted and replanted, and uprooted and replanted, and uprooted and replanted, that in itself can damage us. So if we've even moved house a lot of times when we were younger, or moved churches a lot of times, or just gone through lots and lots and lots of change, it can be that we're actually disturbed and we don't know how to set down roots anywhere, and we're nervous to see ourselves as belonging anywhere, and we like to keep ourselves just a little bit distant. We might engage with a lot of things, but we won't let ourselves put down roots. And then of course, when we're moved, when we're disturbed, the most important thing with a plant is that you make sure that it is in the right soil and it gets good watering, but also that you pack it in well, because otherwise you can get air pockets around it that then create problems where there's huge patches of water around, and it can freeze it, it can damage it, all sorts of problems. It's too much. They can have too much of one thing. And that's what happens when you move from one place to another. Then you can end up in a situation where you're not receiving what you need because you've not been planted properly. in your new situation. I sound like I'm just talking about gardening, but I am talking about our emotional and spiritual health. And of course, finally, you can also be in a situation where you've been poisoned in some way. So you might have been in a family situation where there is already damage. And I'm thinking about things like alcoholism or addictions of any kind, really, or abuse or shouting or arguments or whatever. And they damage us. They damage the way we grow. And it's like the roots are poisoned. Or it could be that we've been alongside something that then we start to pick up. So that can be habits, that can be behaviors, it can be the way we treat people. It can even be, for example, like with a rose bush, if you've got a rose bush that's got black spot, if you put a healthy rose bush beside it, it will get black spot. So you can become affected or infected by things that have affected the people that you grow up around. So what do you do about that? What do you do about that when it's the environment you've grown up in or the environment you're used to, but you know it's bad for you or has been bad for you? Well, Matthew 6 verse 24 says that no man can serve two masters. And Luke 14:26 is a really, really difficult verse because it says that actually we must hate our family. But it means in comparison to how we love God. And realistically, we're told very clearly in the Bible we should honour our family, we should serve our families, we shouldn't leave our families struggling when we have enough, but we should be honourable and fulfil our commitments. But it does say that we must hate our family by comparison to how much we love God. And the reality is, if our family does not want us to grow towards God, doesn't have a desire for us to grow in God, then they will be jealous of our time with God. And they will desire for us to spend our time a different way. And in that situation, you cannot grow towards your family's desires and God's. God should always triumph when we're feeling torn in that way. And the reason is in Romans 11, verse 16 to 32. And I'm going to read that to you. See, the thing is, we are grafted in. We have been placed in a new family. We still have a commitment to our birth family. If we're engaged with our birth family, if we're in contact with them, we still have commitment to those who raised us. But we also have a new commitment. So in Romans 11, verse 17 onwards, it says, well, it's actually from verse 16b. It says, if a root is holy, the branches will be holy too. If some of the branches were broken off, and you were a wild olive branch, and you were grafted in among the other branches, and shared the root that produces the rich oil of the olive tree, then don't brag like you're better than the other branches. If you do brag, be careful. It's not you that sustains the root, but it's the root that sustains you. And it goes on to challenge Gentiles about the attitude they may have towards Jews. Now, there are other verses that talk about this, but the reality is we have been grafted into the true vine. We've been grafted into Judaism. But Judaism was always meant to be fulfilled in the Messiah. It is fulfilled in the Messiah, but of course, a lot of Jews don't know that. So the situation is that some of the branches have actually been removed because they've rejected Jesus. But that doesn't mean we boast because we've been grafted in, because God could have grafted us in anyway. It wasn't a matter of us being grafted in because they have been removed. No, it's not a replacement situation. It's an as well situation. There are plenty of branches remaining. Plenty of Jewish people who've come to faith in Jesus as the Messiah. But we are grafted in alongside. And then we've got all the benefits of the Jewish tradition. For one thing, we've got all the history and all the availability of the Old Testament to find out so much more about our God than we find out just in the New Testament. We get a better sense of his authority and his dominion and his power actually in the Old Testament than we do in the New. And we've been grafted into this healthy olive tree. We were wild olives. We were unformed, and we've been grafted in, and we now have all the benefits of that. Now, in my back garden, I've got an apple tree in a tub, and it grows full-size apples. Not very many of them, but it does. It grows full-size apples, and it has quite a big spread, but it only will go so big. And the reason it will only grow so big is because the large apple tree, or the sapling that would have become a large apple tree, had been grafted onto a root of a small apple tree. And it means that I will get full-sized fruit, but it will only need a small root system, so I can grow it in a pot. Now, this is really advantageous in small gardens, but it's the opposite of what God has done with us. Because with us, we have been grafted into a vine that is so strong, so powerful, and so spreading that we are going to get a much, much bigger life and a much better life than we would have done living wild without God. The problem with that, though, is that when you're grafted into a new thing, you still have the potential to revert back to who you were before. You see, my apple tree, if my apple tree gets buried in soil too deep, then what happens is the soil will affect the tree above the graft line, and that tree will start to grow roots again. But now those roots will be roots from the original type of tree, and that tree will want to grow huge. And because it's trapped in a smaller tub, it will die. It won't survive. Now, bearing in mind we've been grafted into a root that is much bigger and much stronger, if we try to go back into our old environment, if we try to put down roots and go back to how we used to be, then we are going to lessen ourselves. We're going to reduce ourselves. And actually, for the opposite reason, we will nevertheless die. We will struggle and we will suffer. We're not to do this. We're grafted into the new vine. We're no longer part of the original, and we should not try to revert back to it. So if we've come out of damaged soil, if we've come out of a damaged situation, we need to shake off that old situation. In fact, the Bible says that. It says if we're not welcome somewhere even, that we should shake off the dust and move on. When we are being moved on by God, we don't carry what was before, but we let him plant us into a new situation. So we can grow bigger than we ever thought we could be. We can become so much more than we imagined, but only if we become as God designed us to become, grafted in to the new, holy and healthy vine of God. So I hope you're keeping up with the gardening stuff, because it's really helpful to understand this. And of course, when Jesus told these stories and used these examples, they all understood about plants and gardening in a way that maybe we don't now. So I hope you're keeping up. Now, here's the thing about plants. If I transplanted my little conifers into the big thing and I cut them off at the soil level and just stuck them on top of the planter, they would have died pretty much instantly. It's the roots that provide the opportunity to pull nutrients and pull water from the soil. Now, the roots not only provide sustenance, but they also provide stability. Without roots, the plant falls over. Without good roots, heading in both wide and deep, the tree will fall over. Now, the Bible says that we need to dig deep to draw from God's goodness, and that we need to allow what God provides to change and develop us and to follow his blueprint for our life. One thing to know about planting and watering is that you have to be watered in well, but then you have to keep receiving regular watering. Now, we're just heading off to camp, and we are going to receive an amazing blessing while we're at camp. And I had conference in May, so it's May, and then it's August, and then obviously Christmas is a particularly special time. So that's kind of like 3 periods of real focus on God at a level more than normal, to be honest. But if I only got watered 3 times in the year, I would die in between. And this is the problem. We can start relying on the big events and the piped events where somebody does all the work for us and we just receive. And those times are amazing and they're a real blessing. But in between, we need to make sure we are receiving watering, that we are being refreshed. It's one of the reasons we're told not to forsake meeting together, that we need to meet together regularly to be refreshed together and to receive together. But we also have a responsibility to do that ourselves. If you want to grow in God, the Bible says you work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. So that means you live it out. You don't just wait for other people to do it for you. You do it, because you know if your roots aren't good, we can put a stake beside you and attach you to it, but you will become dependent on the stake and you'll never grow your own strong roots. And they've proven that if you stake an apple tree or a fruit tree for too long, it will actually be damaged. You stake it for a season until it's starting to mature, and then you take the stake away so that the roots will develop and spread out, so that the tree, no matter which direction the wind blows from, the tree will be stabilized. It will be mature and it will be able to hold firm. So here we go. 2 Peter 3 verse 18 says, grow. How do we grow? It says, grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Well, that's balance, you see, because if you grow in grace without knowledge, you end up undervaluing what God has given. And a lot of churches, they teach grace, 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 but they don't recognize the enormity of what God has given. But then if we have all knowledge and no grace, we end up either so overwhelmed by the awareness of who God is that we feel we could never be accepted to him because we've forgotten about grace, or we become so proud that he's accepted us that we become puffed up and we become proud and spoiled. We need both grace and knowledge. In fact, when we have true knowledge of God, it shows us grace as well, but we might not get that initially. And that's like having deep roots and wide roots. It creates much better stability. Now here in Colossians 2 verse 7, it says, let your roots grow down into him and let your lives be built on him. Then your faith will grow strong in the truth. Your faith is going to grow strong in knowledge. Your faith will grow strong in the truth you were taught, and you will overflow with thankfulness. And that's what we do when we recognize God's grace in our lives. When we grow in both knowledge and truth and recognize what he has done, then we overflow with joy. So the other thing of that is God knew when he wrote these bits in his Bible, he knew that roots on their own aren't enough. And he knew that he actually within the earth has provided another whole network which we can't even see without a microscope. So when this was written in the Bible, people didn't know this, but God knew this. There's another whole network in the earth, and it's actually a fungal, it's called mycorrhizae, and it's actually a network of root-like tendrils, but they're actually of fungus, and those fungi, they then feed the plant. And that's kind of like the spiritual realm and the Holy Spirit feeding us in a secretive way that we don't even see. But nevertheless, we get the benefit. You see, we can put our roots down, but we have to put our roots into him. We need to put our roots into him to receive what we need to receive. A third thought about roots is that roots intentionally move towards the best provision. Roots can sense where the water is. They can sense where the nutrients are, and they intentionally move towards them. So they move outwards. And that's kind of about receiving everything we can from where we're planted. But they stretch out. We need to stretch and take up all the space available to us and grow into the shape we were meant to be. It's like, be who you are in God and let him be who he is in you. And that's the beauty of this, is we're not designed to all be the same. If you can see my planter at the front, there are two little conifers. There's a couple of big flowers that are just like really tall and thin, and then a splatty on the top, which is like the ones in Anne's front garden, but there's just two single stems of that. There are little splatty, spready ones. There's some falling over the front, ivies and things. And there's, foxgloves, all sorts of different shapes of some spiky leaves and some little flat leaves. And the cumulative effect is an amazing mixture. It's like a little cottage garden in a tub. And that's how God has designed us, that we're all different. And we're all meant to be different. We're not meant to take each other's shapes. We're meant to mature together, but we're going to take the shape that he's designed us to be. Now, don't blame the soil if you're struggling to grow. Some of it is about refusing to take root. Sometimes we will transplant something somewhere, or we'll struggle. We won't want to leave something behind. We won't want to change. And we will struggle to put down roots, and we'll struggle to receive. So we might be there. We might look like we're doing the business. We might be on the planter or apparently in the planter, but we're not letting the roots go down. So you can be planted into a church or into a church family, or planted into the vine of God by being grafted in. But if we refuse to receive, we're going to die. Now, the reason I know that is because it's the same in human life as well. So the nearest example we've got in human life of being in God and God being in us is kind of pregnancy, because in pregnancy our baby is in us, but our blood, even though there's a filter through the placenta, our blood is in the baby. And there's this exchange going on all the time, and even to the point where our cells as mothers get changed by our baby. So we can actually take samples from a mother decades later, and you can identify things that they've gained from the baby, and it's often to do with immune systems and about physical strength. And we have little imprints from our babies on us, which is amazing. And that's true even if we're only pregnant for a very, very short time. It's rather amazing. Why am I telling you about that? Well, I've got a friend who I'm actually godmother to her little girl. And the reason I'm godmother to her little girl is because I'm the only person other than herself and her husband and a couple of nurses who have had the privilege of seeing her oldest child. Because when she was carrying her oldest child, a clot formed in the umbilical cord. And he did not receive what he needed to receive from her. And he died. And he was beautiful. He was born asleep. But he was beautiful. But he couldn't possibly survive because he wasn't receiving what he needed. See, we can be planted in the right place. We can have all the opportunities. But if we create a barrier between ourselves and God, if we refuse to root into him, if we refuse to receive blessing from him and receive what he's teaching us and showing us, even if it's uncomfortable, if we refuse, we run a risk of actually stifling our very lifeblood and of dying. So we need to root, we need to grow, we need to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling by intentionally approaching God regularly in prayer, in worship, and reading our Bible. And we need to grow fast, because we need to grow faster than the thorns grow, because there's always going to be another thing that grows in our lives that tells us that things aren't going to work out, that get doubts growing, that get fear growing, just overwhelm us with life's pressures. We need to grow faster than the worries and the cares. And to do that, we have to grow intentionally. We have to send down those roots to find the nutrition that is there. Finally, I'm just going to round up with this idea. Do you remember the Miracle-Gro adverts where they'd show a hanging basket that's grown without Miracle-Gro and it's a bit weedy, and then one that's grown with Miracle-Gro and it's huge and it's lush and it's long, and it's a great Miracle-Gro advert. And what I will say is, don't forget that miracles happen. See, God is able to do. It says so in Ephesians 3:20. God is able to do immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine. It's like Miracle-Gro for the soul, because that's exactly what it is. Miracle-Gro, the plant food, was named a clever way, but God has been doing that in souls, in human lives forever. He's able to do way more than we can imagine. So you imagine the biggest thing you can imagine God doing in your life, and then realize that that's easy peasy for him, and he can do so much more and so much more and so much more. And the reason I know that is if you think about an apple seed. What grows from an apple seed? Go on, just say it out loud. What grows from an apple seed? Somebody say apple tree. Nah, what grows from an apple seed? is an orchard. Because from the apple tree are lots of apples that then sow and grow more apple trees, and you end up with an orchard. But from that orchard becomes another orchard and another orchard and another orchard. One apple seed has the potential for a whole world full of orchards. The harvest is immeasurably more than we can imagine. So we need to believe in the miracles. And I'm just going to go back to the concept of the vine and the branches to finish, because in John 15 verse 5, Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. We must never cut ourselves off from God. We must never block what he's trying to do. We must remember that the vine we've been planted into is so much more vigorous and strong than what we were as wild vines trying to grow on our own. God offers us so much, but we need to put our roots into him. We need to receive what he offers us. So that's the second sermon of the series. And it's more like a gardening program in some ways than a sermon, but Jesus used these sort of pictures to help us understand. So I hope that's helped. I'm going to sign off now, and you have got a song to finish with, which is talking about this immeasurably more. See, sometimes we can't imagine much, but some songs of faith have been written that are really helpful, and they stir up that faith again and help us to imagine. So we're going to sing Waymaker, and you're going to imagine and trust God for the immeasurably more than you can even imagine. I hope this uploads well and I can get it across to you. I'm going to send Alex the links, and I'm trusting that has all worked. And you guys, ladies and gents, hopefully, Richie, John, any visitors. But ladies, know that I wish I could be with you. I wish I could be in both places at once. I feel quite torn. I love being the pastor of Hope Church. It's a year since Paul Hudson asked me to take on Hope Church. I don't regret saying yes. Have a great week. Be blessed, and put those roots deep down into him this week. Start a process. If you don't do it regularly already, start a process, start a pattern, set a reminder on your phone or on your diary or whatever system you use. If you do it regularly, but it's become a bit of a 5 or a 10-minute thing, maybe let that stretch a bit, let that grow a bit. Throw on a couple of worship songs afterwards, or before, or both. Stop and just dwell in his presence for a while. There's no need to rush. I've got one of the busier lives in the church, and I do this. So maybe, just maybe, you can find time to do it as well. Because if we don't put our roots down into him, we starve. Bye for now. Have a great week. Bless you, bless you.